When I first moved into the old house on the outskirts of Westfield, I thought I'd finally found the peace I'd been chasing. The place had character, creaking floors, high ceilings, and a certain weight to it that only age could create. The mirrors were a peculiar feature, though. Nearly every room had one, large and looming, as though someone had wanted to keep an eye on every corner of the house. At first, the mirrors intrigued me, lending a sense of grandeur to the space, like something out of a period drama. But as the days passed, I began to notice small oddities, things I could brush off as tricks of light or exhaustion. The first time I really noticed something, it was late at night. I'd been working late, half asleep, lost in the hum of my laptop, when I caught my reflection in the mirror on the wall opposite the couch. The mirror didn't show just my reflection. Instead, it seemed to show something different, like a lag or a smudge, as though I was being viewed through a grimy lens. I blinked a few times, rubbing my eyes, but the image held steady. My own face looked slightly off, as if my expression wasn't quite matching my emotions. I shook it off, telling myself I was just overtired. After that, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the mirrors. I started noticing it more frequently. In the bathroom mirror, for instance, I saw a fleeting glimpse of what I thought was my reflection turning to look at me when I wasn't even facing it. I told myself it was nothing, just shadows and reflections bending weirdly, but the discomfort lingered. One night, after a particularly rough day, I felt a strange pull toward the mirror in my bedroom. It was one of those old-fashioned, full-length antique mirrors with an ornate wooden frame that looked as though it had witnessed countless lives. As I stared at my reflection, something caught my eye, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that wasn't my own. My heart thudded as I leaned closer, studying every inch of my reflection. For a split second, I thought I saw someone else entirely. The face staring back at me was mine, and yet not mine. It looked tired and distant, as if the person reflected was just barely there, watching. I stepped back, feeling a chill race down my spine. The face remained expressionless, but I could swear it was watching me with a strange, unnatural intensity. Each night after that, I felt an uneasy sensation whenever I approached any of the mirrors in the house. I stopped looking into them directly, only catching glimpses from the corner of my eye. It was unsettling, but every time I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, I'd feel that same eerie sensation. One particularly late night, while lying in bed with my back to the mirror, I swore I heard a soft whisper. It was low and indistinct, almost like a breath. My skin prickled, and I held my breath, listening intently. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Just as I was about to dismiss it as another figment of my imagination, I heard it again, a soft, almost pleading murmur, coming from the mirror behind me. I turned over slowly, my pulse racing, staring at the darkened glass. The room was pitch black, save for a sliver of moonlight filtering in through the window. The mirror was just a dim, silent shape, yet I could feel a presence on the other side, watching, holding its breath just as I was holding mine. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, a primal, instinctual fear. I wasn't alone in that room. The next morning, a layer of unease clung to me. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, but every time I walked by a mirror, I felt the sensation return, gnawing at me. Something was wrong. I could feel it like a shadow, lurking just out of sight, waiting. That day I avoided looking into any mirrors. It was irrational, I knew, but after the events of the previous night, I wanted distance. The hours dragged on, and by evening I almost convinced myself that I'd been overreacting, maybe even imagining things. I'd been under stress. It was natural for the mind to play tricks. And yet, the thought kept creeping back in. What had I heard last night? That evening, I decided to confront my fears. I set up my laptop and moved the camera so it faced the mirror in my bedroom, recording a time-lapse of the room overnight. I needed to prove to myself that it was all in my head, that my reflection was just that, a reflection. Nothing more. As I lay in bed, I couldn't help but feel a shiver of apprehension. The mirror loomed like a dark portal beside me, and every creak of the house, every brush of wind against the window, made my skin prickle with anxiety. Sleep came in fits and starts, and when I finally drifted off, it was with the lingering image of my own face staring back at me. The next morning, I dreaded reviewing the footage, but I needed closure. Sitting on the edge of my bed, I pulled up the video and began watching. At first, everything was normal. My reflection remained still, following my movements as expected, though I could still feel that peculiar energy in the room, even through the screen. About halfway through the video, though, something happened. My reflection seemed to lag, as though it hesitated when I turned away. I rewound the video, watching closely. My pulse quickened as I realized that my reflection wasn't moving in sync with me at all. It was subtle at first, but clear, a second of delay, and then it stayed still, even when I had already left the room. I stopped breathing, watching with horrified fascination as my reflection continued to stare into the empty room, an unreadable expression on its face. But it wasn't just staring, it was watching, like it was aware, scanning the space as though looking for something or someone. Cold dread settled over me as the reflection slowly lifted its hand, pressing it against the glass, leaving a faint, foggy imprint. I rewound the footage, watching again and again, hoping I was mistaken. But each time, the hand lifted, fingers pressed against the glass, and remained there, motionless, as though waiting. That night, I covered the mirror with a blanket. The weight of that decision settled heavy on my chest, but I couldn't bear the thought of looking into it again. I needed sleep, a few hours of peace, something to clear my head. But the house didn't let me rest. Around midnight, I awoke to the unmistakable sound of fabric rustling. My heart pounded as I slowly sat up, eyes straining in the dark. I held my breath, listening, hoping that I was just imagining it. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate slide of fabric against wood coming from the mirror. The blanket I'd placed over it was moving, slipping off slowly as though something or someone was pushing it from the other side. The edge of the mirror glinted in the darkness, and I watched transfixed as the cloth fell to the floor, revealing the dark surface once again. And there it was, my reflection, but with a twisted, vacant expression. Its eyes were wide, almost hungry, and they stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My hand moved to cover my mouth, stifling a gasp, but my reflection didn't mimic the gesture. Instead, it stood there, its hand still pressed against the glass, as though waiting for me to make the next move. I couldn't bring myself to look away, paralyzed by fear and disbelief. Then it began to move. Not my reflection, but the figure in the mirror, slow and deliberate, as it leaned closer to the glass, its face distorting in a silent scream. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, but the figure remained, staring with those empty, hollow eyes. The mirror seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a dark energy radiating from it that felt almost tangible, as though it wanted to pull me in. I forced myself to turn away, breaking eye contact, and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. That night, I slept on the couch, but sleep was impossible. Every shadow felt like it was reaching for me, every creak like a whisper from the mirror, calling me back. And as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that mirror was growing stronger, waiting for the moment I'd be too weak to resist. After that night, everything changed. The weight of the mirror's gaze, that lurking, insidious presence, lingered with me every moment I spent in the house. I avoided my bedroom entirely, keeping the door shut tight, as if that single, flimsy barrier could somehow contain whatever was within that mirror. Yet, even from downstairs, I could feel it. Like an itch in the back of my mind, an awareness that my reflection was waiting. But it wasn't just in the bedroom anymore. One evening, while washing dishes in the kitchen, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye in the small mirror by the sink. I froze, my soapy hands trembling, as I forced myself to look up. My reflection stared back, but there was something subtly wrong. Its eyes seemed deeper, darker, as if some light had gone out of them. And though I'd been standing perfectly still, my reflection blinked. My stomach twisted as I turned away from the mirror, only to catch sight of my reflection in the glass of the microwave door. The figure stared back with that same vacant intensity, as if challenging me to look away. My skin prickled with fear, and I backed out of the kitchen, heart pounding, desperate to escape. That night, I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The plan was simple. I'd pack a few essentials, stay in a hotel for a couple of nights, and figure out my next steps. As I moved about the house, gathering my things, I felt a strange sensation of being watched, not just from the mirrors, but from every shadowed corner, every empty room. It was as though the entire house had become an extension of that sinister presence, an accomplice in its hunt. When I returned to my bedroom to grab my wallet, I hesitated by the door, hand trembling on the knob. Part of me wanted to leave without going back in, to run and never look back. But something, a strange, undeniable compulsion, drew me in. I pushed open the door and stepped inside, forcing myself to face the mirror one last time. The blanket I'd used to cover it lay crumpled on the floor, revealing the glass in all its dreadful clarity. My reflection was already there, waiting, with an expression that was almost expectant. It looked at me with a hunger that made my skin crawl, eyes hollow and bottomless. I knew without a doubt that whatever it wanted me. It was waiting for me to come closer. My legs felt like lead as I took a single step forward, then another, drawn to the mirror despite every instinct telling me to run. My reflection watched with that eerie, patient gaze, a slight, twisted smile tugging at its lips. I reached the edge of the mirror, my face inches away from the glass, so close that I could see my own breath fogging up the surface. And then it happened. My reflection moved without me, raising its hand slowly and pressing it flat against the glass. My fingers tingled with an electric chill as I reached out instinctively, mirroring its gesture, my hand meeting the cold, smooth surface. For a heartbeat, I felt a slight pull, as though something was tugging at my hand from the other side. And in that moment, I understood. The reflection, it wasn't just a reflection. It was a presence, trapped within the glass, waiting for a way out. My hand trembled as I tried to pull it back, but my fingers seemed to stick to the mirror, held in place by an invisible force. My reflection's smile widened, a sickening grin that twisted across its face. I watched in horror as its other hand moved up, pressing against the glass with a predatory grace, as though it was savoring this moment. Panicking, I yanked my hand back with all my strength, stumbling backward and nearly tripping over the edge of the bed. I gasped, holding my wrist, feeling a cold, burning sensation where my hand had met the glass. But the reflection didn't follow me. Instead, it pressed itself closer against the surface, its mouth moving, forming words I couldn't hear. Yet somehow, I knew what it was saying. Let me in. My pulse hammered as I backed toward the door, unable to tear my gaze from that figure in the mirror, its eyes wide with anticipation, its hands splayed against the glass as though it was ready to break through. I felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to let it in, as if its voice was calling to me from somewhere deep within my own mind, whispering, coaxing. I forced myself to look away, to turn and bolt from the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for breath, trying to shake the feeling of that cold, unnatural touch. But even with the door closed, I could still feel it watching, its presence like a dark shadow at the edge of my thoughts. In the dim, flickering light of the hallway, I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror coursing through me. One of the small mirrors by the stairs reflected not just my face, but a figure standing just behind me, watching with that same twisted smile. I stumbled down the stairs, out of the house, desperate to escape, but even as I reached the safety of the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with me. Every glass surface, every window, seemed to hold a glimpse of that dark, distorted figure lurking in the background, biding its time. As I looked back at the house, shadows flickered in the windows, and in the dim reflection on the glass door, I could see it. A figure with hollow eyes, pressed against the glass, watching me leave. Its smile etched into my mind like a brand. Even now, as I write this, I catch glimpses of it in every mirror, every reflection, as though it followed me out, waiting, lurking, watching for the perfect moment to finally come through. I moved into my new house on a quiet street in Indiana, seeking some peace and routine. It was a charming neighborhood, the kind you'd imagine in an old suburban postcard. All the houses had neat, trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and friendly neighbors who gave polite nods as they walked their dogs or watered their flowers. My new home was just right, cozy but spacious enough, with a porch where I could sit with my coffee and pretend I was part of this picturesque American dream. Next door stood an older house. It looked as though it had been there forever, the wood slightly weathered and paint faded, but giving off an almost dignified charm. One afternoon, as I was settling in, I noticed a couple moving into the house. They were elderly, and there was something hauntingly quiet about them. The man moved slowly, as if weighed down by the years, and the woman followed, her gaze fixed straight ahead. They didn't notice me, even when I tried to wave hello. I dismissed it as them being preoccupied, or perhaps just a bit shy. Days passed, and things seemed ordinary enough, but the oddity of the couple next door lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the memory of how their eyes had seemed so hollow, their expressions distant. Despite their eerie demeanor, I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself it was all in my head. On the third night, though, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. I sat up in bed, straining to hear, my ears catching faint murmurs and slow, dragging footsteps. They seemed to come from the direction of my neighbor's house. I checked the clock, 2 a.m., and lay there, my heart thudding, wondering if it was just the house settling or some animal rustling around. But the sounds continued, steady and almost rhythmic. After what felt like an eternity, they faded, leaving me wide awake and unnerved. The next night, the noises returned, exactly at the same time. This time they were louder, unmistakably human. A low, murmuring voice, almost as if someone was in conversation, mixed with the creak of old floorboards and the steady shuffle of feet. I lay in bed, rigid with unease. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them could explain the strange, ghostly quality of the sounds. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe thin walls amplifying sounds from farther away. Curiosity and unease gnawed at me, so the next day I went for a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to bump into someone who might know more about my new neighbors. When I mentioned the elderly couple to Mrs. Whitaker, the friendly old woman 2 houses down, she looked at me with a curious expression, her brows furrowing slightly. "Oh, the Hughes?" she said slowly, her voice filled with hesitation. "I think you might be mistaken. The Hughes passed away, it must be 30 years ago now. Tragic accident, the house caught fire while they were asleep. Terrible thing." I froze, feeling a chill creep over me. I tried to explain that I'd seen them moving in, that I'd watched them bring boxes inside. Mrs. Whitaker just shook her head, giving me a look of pity. "Maybe someone else bought the house. It was empty for years, after what happened." She sighed, almost as if recalling a ghost of a memory, but patting my arm and walking away. I returned home with a strange, gnawing feeling. Mrs. Whitaker had to be mistaken. Or I had somehow been mistaken. But that night, the sounds came again, this time even closer, echoing through the walls as if they were in my own house. At exactly 2 in the morning, the noises started, a faint, raspy whisper, dragging footsteps, and the creak of old wood. My pulse raced, and I felt a familiar dread creeping in. I lay there, every nerve on edge, and as I strained to listen, I realized the voice was calling my name. The whisper grew louder, like a slow murmur clawing its way through the walls. It was barely audible, but I recognized it. My name, repeated over and over, like a chant. I forced myself to stay still, too afraid to move, as the whispers grew louder. They were so close now that I could almost feel the breath behind them, like a faint breeze ghosting over my skin. Then abruptly, the sounds stopped. The house fell silent, leaving only my frantic heartbeat echoing in my ears. My room was dark, save for the faint light seeping in through the window, casting long shadows on the walls. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind, an illusion fueled by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. The following day, I felt the weight of last night's encounter in every step. I tried to carry on as usual, hoping the daylight would wash away the dread that had settled in my bones. Yet, the memory of the whispers and those soft, dragging footsteps wouldn't leave me. I found myself glancing at the house next door more often, watching for any sign of movement, any hint of life beyond its peeling shutters and weathered walls. But all I saw was emptiness, and that emptiness felt watchful. As evening approached, a heavy sense of anticipation hung over me. Part of me hoped the sounds from the previous nights wouldn't return, that they'd been nothing more than my imagination playing tricks. But as midnight crept closer, a thick silence fell over the neighborhood, amplifying even the faintest of sounds. And then, right on cue, the familiar creaking and shuffling began. This time, the noises felt closer, almost as if they were seeping through the walls of my own home. I lay in bed, paralyzed with unease, straining to hear. The murmuring voices came in soft waves, barely audible, but distinct enough to sense an eerie rhythm, as if they were repeating the same words over and over again. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I felt certain it was the same thing each time. The thought made my skin prickle, and a cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I'd had enough. Driven by a strange mix of fear and curiosity, I got out of bed and made my way to the window overlooking the neighboring house. Through the darkness, I could see faint shapes moving inside, shadows shifting as if in a slow, solemn dance. My breath caught in my throat. The figures moved with a stilted grace, almost like puppets on strings, bound to repeat the same motions. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as the figures passed in and out of view, their ghostly forms fading into the shadows and reappearing, like flickering images from an old film reel. Then, as if sensing my gaze, one of them stopped. It turned toward the window, and I could have sworn it looked directly at me, its hollow, sunken eyes meeting mine through the darkness. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I stumbled back from the window, my legs shaking. I tried to convince myself that it was impossible, that what I had seen was a trick of the light, but the chill that clung to me was all too real. The next morning, I returned to Mrs. Whitaker, desperate to know more about the history of the house. She gave me a wary look, the kind that spoke of secrets best left buried, but finally relented, speaking in a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. After the fire, people said they'd hear things at night, voices and footsteps. At first, folks thought it was just an old house settling, you know. She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. But then a few brave souls went in to look around. No one lived there yet. They swore they saw shadows moving, heard voices coming from empty rooms. I asked her what she thought it meant, but she just shook her head. Some say they were trapped there, their spirits bound to that place. Others think, well, that something darker has taken their place, wearing their forms like a disguise. She gave a shiver, clutching her cardigan tightly. Sometimes the dead don't get to rest, and sometimes something else finds a way to fill the empty spaces. That night the sounds came again. This time they were even louder, like whispers slipping through every crack and corner of my house, wrapping around me in an unseen shroud. My heart pounded as I realized they weren't just in the neighbor's house anymore. They were here, with me. Unable to bear it any longer, I went to my front door, peering out into the night. The street was empty, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But when I looked toward the house next door, my blood ran cold. The elderly couple stood on their porch, perfectly still, staring in my direction. They didn't move, didn't blink. They just stood there, two shadowy figures outlined in the faint glow of the streetlight, their faces lost in shadow. I called out, my voice shaky, Is someone there?" They didn't answer. Instead, the faintest hint of a smile flickered across their faces, a grotesque, twisted thing that chilled me to my core. I took a step back, feeling the door frame dig into my back, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. But even as my instincts screamed at me to run, I couldn't look away. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they turned and vanished into the darkness of their house, the door closing behind them with a soft click. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the whole world had gone still, holding its breath. I retreated inside, locking the door and turning off all the lights, hoping the darkness would hide me. But even then, in the pitch black of my own home, I felt their gaze, a cold, piercing stare that followed me into my dreams. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that whatever lived in that house wasn't going to leave me alone. After that night, sleep became a distant memory. Every creak, every shadow in my house seemed alive, as if whispering warnings just beyond my reach. The whispers from next door began to slip into my home, winding through the walls and creeping under the doors. No matter where I went, I felt their presence, a cold, silent pull, like a hand reaching from the darkness. On the fifth night, driven by fear and exhaustion, I decided to confront the couple. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in my own home, a prisoner to invisible eyes and murmured voices. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a heart full of dread, I left my house and stepped onto the quiet street. The night was thick, still, as if waiting. The house loomed like a dark sentinel, its shadow casting a cold weight over the yard. I approached the front door, heart pounding, and knocked. The sound echoed, a hollow noise swallowed by the silence around me. For a moment, there was nothing, and I wondered if I should just turn and leave. But then the door creaked open, revealing the dim, cavernous interior. The hallway stretched before me, filled with the smell of old wood and dust, and something else, a hint of char, like the faintest memory of smoke. Shadows lined the walls, twisted and unnatural, their shapes distorting in the flickering light. I took a step inside, every nerve screaming at me to turn back, but something in that house pulled me in. At the end of the hallway I saw them, Margaret and William, standing still as statues, their faces half hidden in the gloom. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My heart hammered as they slowly turned to face me, their eyes dark and empty, their expressions blank. There was no life in their gaze, only an endless silent void. "Why are you here?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. Margaret tilted her head, her mouth twisting into a strange, almost mechanical smile. "We're here because you invited us in," she said in a voice that was barely more than a rasp, like something from a distant memory. William stood beside her, his face expressionless, his eyes fixed on me with a predatory stillness. I took a step back, the weight of their words sinking in. Somehow, without realizing it, I had let them in, let their presence seep into my life, binding them to me. I could feel the air growing colder, pressing against me like a suffocating blanket. My breaths came in short gasps, but I forced myself to stay, to ask what I'd been dreading. What do you want?" William's mouth twisted into a mocking smile. "We want a place to stay," he whispered, each word heavy with a chilling finality. "Our home, it's no longer enough." The realization struck me like a cold wave. They weren't just haunting their house, they were searching for a new place to inhabit, a new soul to latch onto. And I was the one who had called them, just by my curiosity, by my inability to leave well enough alone. I turned to flee, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. But as I reached the doorway, I felt something cold and heavy wrap around my wrist. I looked down, horrified to see a skeletal hand gripping me, its touch like ice against my skin. I tried to pull away, but the grip tightened, pulling me back, closer to that dark hallway. I looked up, only to find myself face to face with Margaret, her expression twisted into something dark and malicious. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice filling my mind like a dark fog. "You belong here now." I wrenched my arm free and stumbled back, running blindly into the night, my heart pounding as I slammed the door of my own house behind me. But the moment I caught my breath, I knew something was terribly wrong. The silence in my house was deeper than ever before, a hollow, empty void that felt wrong. As I turned, I saw them. Margaret and William, standing in my living room, their eyes fixed on me with that same haunting emptiness. They had followed me, crossed the threshold of my home, and now they were here, part of my life, bound to me like shadows. My knees buckled, and I fell back, staring at them in helpless terror as they stood, silent and unmoving, watching. I felt a cold weight settle over me, as if my very soul was being pulled from within. I had nowhere left to run, no place to hide. They had found a new home. From that night on, I was no longer alone. Margaret and William lingered, silent sentinels who followed me from room to room, their eyes ever watchful. I could feel their presence in every shadow, hear their whispers in the silence. They were a part of me now, woven into the fabric of my life. And no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, they would always be there, waiting, watching, an eternal echo that would never let me go. Being home alone wasn't new to me, but it always felt different when my parents were out of town for more than just a night. The house had a way of feeling too quiet, especially in the evenings. It was an old place, originally my grandparents before we moved in, and they passed down more than just the house. Every corner was filled with relics and trinkets from a different era. My mom always called it vintage charm. To me, it felt like the house itself was alive, each object carrying the weight of silent memories, lingering in the air. After finishing up dinner, I found myself wandering around aimlessly, feeling the restlessness that only comes from too much solitude. On a whim, I decided to head to the basement, a place that, to be honest, always gave me the creeps. It was dimly lit and full of old things my grandmother had stored there. But curiosity got the best of me, and I figured, if nothing else, maybe I'd find something interesting, or at least distracting. While rummaging through boxes, I came across a wooden chest that looked far older than anything else down there. It had strange carvings etched into its surface, symbols I didn't recognize, swirling in intricate patterns across the dark, polished wood. I tried lifting the lid, but it was heavier than I expected, and the wood groaned as if it hadn't been opened in years. Inside, I found something I hadn't seen in any of my grandmother's things before, an old game board. It was different from any board game I'd ever seen. The wood was worn and smooth, with faded etchings of eyes and symbols, each corner marked by strange letters that didn't seem like English. My hand brushed against a small slip of paper tucked inside the box, and I picked it up, the faded ink barely legible. "Do not play this game if you fear what watches." I laughed it off, telling myself it was just some sort of gimmick to make the game feel mysterious. It was probably a way for her to scare off kids from messing with her things. But as I sat there, something about the board kept drawing me in, like it had its own quiet allure. The house was quiet around me, the dim light from the bulb overhead casting long shadows over everything, making the carved eyes on the board seem to glint back at me. Ignoring the warning, I set up the game on the floor, arranging the pieces, which were simple but felt oddly heavy for their size. I placed my hands on the small circular marker in the center of the board, which had a smooth, almost glass-like surface. There were no instructions, no clear objective, but something told me to start moving the piece clockwise. With each rotation, it was as if a strange energy was filling the air, a tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. At first, nothing happened, and I almost laughed at myself for feeling nervous. But as I moved the marker, a quiet, almost imperceptible sound started to fill the room. It was faint, like a soft scratching, as if something were moving just out of sight. I paused, glancing around the basement, but everything seemed as still as before. The sound disappeared the moment I stopped moving the piece. A strange curiosity pushed me to continue, and as I moved the piece again, the scratching returned, louder this time, like something brushing against the walls of the basement. I felt a chill, but I shook it off. It was just my imagination, I told myself, and continued playing. Suddenly, I felt a distinct, unshakable sensation, like I was being watched. My skin prickled as I glanced over my shoulder, but the basement was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of the light bulb. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone down there. The longer I played, the more intense it became, as though there were invisible eyes fixed on me, observing every movement. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the game, but each time I advanced the piece, the sense of presence grew stronger, almost tangible. I felt a cold pressure on the back of my neck, as if a breath had passed close to my skin, and I froze, heart pounding. But the room remained empty, still, the only sound my shallow breaths echoing off the walls. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I put the game back in the chest, shut the lid, and stumbled upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. It was just an old game, I told myself. Nothing more. But as I sat in my room that night, trying to calm down, I swore I could feel that same prickling sensation on my skin, as though something had followed me up from the basement. Shadows seemed to stretch longer than usual, lingering in the corners of the room. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the echo of an overactive imagination. Yet even in the safety of my bed, with my blankets pulled up to my chin, I felt those invisible eyes watching, patient and silent, as if waiting for me to bring the game out once again. The morning brought little comfort. Despite the sunlight filtering through my bedroom window, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The events from the night before seemed surreal in the daylight, like a foggy dream that lingered just beyond clear memory. I told myself it was just nerves from being alone, that maybe I'd spooked myself with the silly game in the basement. Still, an uneasiness lingered, a quiet tension that I couldn't brush off. I went through my day as normally as I could, but every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something. Nothing was there. Of course, just the empty hallway or the quiet hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. But every time I turned away, the same prickling sensation returned, like a presence just out of sight. By evening, the house felt impossibly still. It was a silence so thick it pressed against my ears, amplifying every sound. I couldn't get the game out of my mind. It was as though some invisible force was pulling me back to it. I tried to ignore it, distracting myself with TV and scrolling through my phone, but the feeling persisted, creeping up my spine like a cold hand. Finally, unable to resist, I made my way to the basement door. As I descended the stairs, the air grew colder, heavier, and that eerie silence thickened around me. The wooden chest sat in the corner, exactly where I'd left it. My heart pounded as I approached, feeling like a moth drawn to a flame. I lifted the lid and took out the game, the wooden board's carving seeming sharper, almost alive under the dim light. I set it on the floor and took a deep breath. I don't know what compelled me to keep playing, but I found myself drawn back to the game, as if it had a mind of its own, as if it was waiting for me. The minute my fingers touched the marker, a strange chill seeped into my skin, prickling every nerve. This time, as I moved the piece, the scratching sound returned, louder and closer. My stomach clenched, but I couldn't stop. The marker slid around the board in slow, deliberate movements, guided by some unseen force. The longer I played, the more intense the sounds became, like something creeping through the basement shadows, each step bringing it closer. A whisper began to fill the room, faint and distant at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It sounded like a voice, indistinct and hollow, as if speaking from far away. I strained to make out the words, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It was impossible to ignore the chill spreading through the room, pressing against my skin like a vice. I closed my eyes, hoping to shut out the sounds, but the whisper only grew louder, almost as if it was directly behind me. My hands trembled, the marker slipping from my fingers, and I dared to look over my shoulder. The basement was empty, but shadows seemed to stretch toward me, darker and more defined, shapes that vaguely resembled eyes watching from the edges of the room. Panicked, I clutched the marker and moved it faster, hoping that finishing the game would end the nightmare. But as I moved it, the whisper transformed into a hiss, and the shadows deepened, closing in around me. I felt trapped, as if something was wrapping itself around me, drawing nearer with each passing second. I forced myself to stop, my fingers frozen on the marker. The silence that followed was deafening, a suffocating emptiness that filled the room. But in that silence, I felt it, a presence, cold and invasive, hovering inches away, as though it was leaning over me, watching, waiting. My heart thundered, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs felt paralyzed, locked in place by an invisible grip. The air grew colder, and a faint, eerie glow began to emanate from the board, illuminating symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I tried to stand, to put distance between myself and whatever was there, but it was as though the game wouldn't let me go. The feeling of being observed was overpowering, an awareness pressing against my mind, seeping into every corner of my thoughts. Finally, with every ounce of strength, I pushed myself back, stumbling to my feet. I left the game where it was, bolting up the stairs and slamming the basement door shut behind me. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. But the house was silent, as if nothing had happened. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination. Yet, as I turned to head to my room, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. Faint marks, like smudges, marred the walls of the hallway. They looked like handprints, streaked across the surface as if something had clawed its way up from the basement. I staggered back, my mind racing. I hadn't touched the walls. They'd been clean when I came down that morning. But now they bore the traces of something that had followed me, that had left a trail of its presence behind. I tried to wipe the marks away, but they wouldn't budge, as if burned into the paint. Retreating to my room, I shut the door and pressed my back against it, trying to block out the chilling realization. Whatever I'd awakened in the basement, it was now in the house, closer than ever. The room felt colder, the shadows darker, and as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Sleep eluded me that night, and every sound seemed amplified, each creak and whisper reminding me that I was no longer alone. The game's pull still lingered in my mind, and despite everything, I felt the growing urge to return to it, as though it was calling me, waiting for me to make the next move. By the next evening, my nerves were frayed, each sound in the house setting me on edge. The marks on the walls had darkened, like shadows seared into the paint, and I could feel the weight of that presence everywhere I went. It was as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my next move. Despite the fear that clawed at me, I couldn't resist the pull of the game. I'd tried staying away, forcing myself to ignore it, but each time I passed the basement door, the urge grew stronger, as if something deep within was calling me, beckoning me to finish what I had started. Unable to fight it any longer, I descended the stairs. The basement was colder than before, the air thick with a chill that seeped into my skin. The game lay in the center of the floor, exactly where I'd left it, its symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. I approached it, feeling an unnatural compulsion as I knelt down and placed my hands on the marker. The instant my fingers touched it, a shiver ran through me, and the basement seemed to close in around me, shadows stretching along the walls like hands reaching out. This time, as I moved the piece, the silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. Each movement felt heavy, deliberate, as though the game itself were guiding my hands. And then, without warning, the whispers returned, louder, more insistent, wrapping around me in layers of voices that overlapped and intermingled, filling my mind with their urgent demands. I could feel the presence drawing nearer, almost tangible, its unseen eyes locked on me. I froze, paralyzed by the sensation, my skin prickling as though something cold and unseen had brushed against me. The whispers grew louder, becoming clearer, forming words that sent ice through my veins. "Let us in." Panic surged through me, and I tried to pull my hands away from the marker, but they wouldn't budge. It was as though the game had a hold on me, binding me to the spot. My breaths came in shallow gasps as the shadows in the room thickened, moving closer, taking on forms that seemed to hover at the edge of my vision. Desperate, I forced myself to look up, and my heart stopped. Standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness, were the outlines of figures, their eyes gleaming faintly, fixed on me with a hunger that I couldn't escape. They stood motionless, watching, waiting, as if they were waiting for me to finish the game. The words on the board shifted, rearranging themselves into a message. One last move. My hands, compelled by an unseen force, guided the marker across the board. As it moved, the figures in the shadows seemed to ripple, edging closer, the air growing colder with each inch the marker advanced. With the final move, a rush of icy air flooded the room, and the figures in the shadows surged forward, their forms blurring as they crossed into the light. I felt a weight press down on me, an overwhelming force that filled every corner of my mind, pushing its way in, settling deep within me. The eyes surrounding me burned into my skin, and I could feel them, inside, watching, waiting. The game board glowed one last time, the light pulsing before fading, leaving the basement in utter darkness. Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as though the entire house was holding its breath. I sat there frozen, my heart hammering, the chill of their presence seeping into every inch of my being. When I finally mustered the strength to stand, I stumbled up the stairs, closing the basement door behind me, hoping that somehow it would keep whatever I had unleashed at bay. But the house was different now, darker, the shadows seeming to follow me, lingering in every corner. I retreated to my room, locking the door and pulling the covers up to my chin, but the feeling of being watched remained. The whispers filled the silence, faint but unmistakable, a reminder that I had let them in, that they were a part of me now. As I lay there, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror across the room. My own reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. The eyes looking out from the glass weren't mine. They were darker, colder, filled with the same emptiness I had seen in the basement. And as I watched, the reflection's mouth twisted into a slow, sinister smile. I tried to turn away, but the reflection moved on its own, leaning closer, its eyes glinting with a malice that sent shivers down my spine. I realized then that the game hadn't just released them, it had bound them to me, an eternal presence that would never let go. From that night on, I was never truly alone. The whispers followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of the eyes that watched, the presence that lingered. And no matter how far I ran, how much I tried to forget, I knew they would always be there, waiting for me to make one more move. Being alone in the house was a rare treat. With my parents gone for the week, I had the entire place to myself, a chance to just unwind and take things at my own pace. The house was peaceful, tucked away in a quiet corner of Vermont, surrounded by trees that rustled gently in the autumn breeze. I spent most of the day catching up on reading and enjoying the calm. The quiet had its charms, but as evening crept in, the house took on a different character. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the ticking of the clock felt louder, each second amplifying the silence. Still, I told myself it was just nerves. The house had always been a bit too still at night, especially without the usual sounds of my parents moving around. After dinner, I settled on the couch with a book. Just as I was getting into it, my phone buzzed on the coffee table, its glow casting a sharp light in the dim room. A number I didn't recognize flashed on the screen. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. Hello. There was nothing but silence on the other end. Not a click, not a breath. I pulled the phone away, checking the screen to see if the call had disconnected, but it was still active. Hello, I repeated, louder this time, feeling a strange prickling sensation at the base of my neck. The silence was unnerving, almost heavy, pressing into my ear as if someone was there, just refusing to speak. I hung up, chalking it up to a prank or a wrong number. But the moment I placed the phone back down, it rang again, the same number. This time, I ignored it, letting it ring until it stopped. But almost immediately, it started up again, each ring more insistent than the last. After a few moments of hesitation, I answered once more. Hello, asked, my voice strained. A soft rustling crackled through the line, like someone adjusting their grip on the phone. And then, nothing. No voice, no indication that someone was on the other end. My heart pounded, a nervous edge creeping into my mind. It felt like the silence on the line was intentional, as if whoever was there wanted me to feel their presence without speaking a single word. After a moment, the line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone, unsure what to think. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me and went back to my book, though the words seemed to blur together, my mind too distracted by the strange calls. An hour later, just as I'd started to relax, my phone buzzed again. My stomach twisted when I saw it was the same number. Reluctantly, I answered. This time, a voice broke the silence. Soft, almost gentle, but with a familiarity that felt unnerving. Are you alone, Lily? My heart skipped. They knew my name. Who is this? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. The person on the other end chuckled lightly, the sound echoing in my ear with an uncomfortable intimacy. You're sitting on the couch, aren't you? The voice continued. You've been reading that book all evening. I froze, my eyes darting around the room, trying to convince myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was someone from the neighborhood playing a prank. But no one knew I'd been reading. I hadn't told anyone my plans for the night. My voice trembled as I spoke. Who are you? There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, low and calm. You're wearing your blue sweater, the one with the little tear on the sleeve. It's your favorite, isn't it? The sweater. I glanced down at my arm, fingers brushing over the small tear just above my elbow. My heart raced, and I felt my skin prickle with a cold sweat. Whoever this was, they were watching me. They knew details no one should know, things I hadn't mentioned to anyone. Stop it, I whispered, gripping the phone tightly. This isn't funny. The voice laughed softly, and there was a tone to it that sent chills down my spine. I'm only reminding you of things you already know, Lily. I'm not telling you anything you don't want to hear. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest, a primal urge to drop the phone and run filling me, but I was frozen, held in place by that voice. There was something unsettlingly familiar about it, as if it wasn't a stranger at all, as if I knew the voice from somewhere, though I couldn't quite place it. Just as I worked up the courage to respond, the line went dead again, the silence of the house rushing in around me. I sat there, my mind racing, every nerve on edge. It was just a prank, I told myself. Someone was messing with me, trying to scare me while I was alone. But the way they'd known exactly what I was doing, what I was wearing, felt too close, too intimate. I checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked before heading to my room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the quiet house and the late hour get to me. But as I lay in bed, my phone still clutched in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that someone or something was watching, waiting. And just as my eyelids began to grow heavy, my phone buzzed once more. The screen glowed with the same unknown number. Heart pounding, I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Hello? This time the voice was softer, almost a murmur. Don't worry, Lily. I know you better than anyone. I know everything about you. The voice paused, and in the silence I could almost hear it breathing, as if it were right beside me. And then, before I could respond, it added one last sentence that sent a chill through my very bones. I'll talk to you again soon. The following morning, daylight brought little comfort. The voice on the phone still echoed in my mind, lingering in my thoughts like a fog I couldn't shake. I tried telling myself that it was just a prank, that I'd overreacted in the isolation of the night. But as I went about my day, the uneasy feeling persisted, clinging to me like a shadow. I went through the usual motions, making coffee, checking emails, and trying to distract myself. Yet, every time I passed the living room or caught a glimpse of my phone on the table, a shiver ran through me. I couldn't forget how the voice had known exactly where I was and what I was doing, things no one else could possibly know. As the day wore on, I found myself dreading the evening. By late afternoon, the sky had grown overcast, and the house seemed to darken with it, filling with the same eerie silence that had blanketed it the night before. I paced the room, glancing at the clock every few minutes, hoping the hours would pass quickly. But time seemed to slow, each second stretching endlessly. Around 7, just as the last traces of daylight slipped away, my phone buzzed again. My heart leaped, my stomach twisting, as I picked it up and saw the same unknown number on the screen. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the answer button, but something inside me, a mix of dread and curiosity, urged me to pick up. Hello? My voice came out in a whisper, barely audible. There was a brief silence, and then the voice spoke, calm and measured. Did you lock all the doors, Lily? I froze, glancing instinctively toward the front door, though I knew I'd checked it earlier. Who are you? I demanded, my voice shaky but trying to sound firm. What do you want? The voice chuckled softly, the sound chilling in its familiarity. I want nothing, Lily. I just want to talk. Don't you remember our talks? A strange sensation washed over me, like a memory buried just beneath the surface, slipping away before I could fully grasp it. I clutched the phone tightly, forcing myself to stay calm. I don't know you, I replied, the words coming out firmer this time. Oh, but you do, the voice continued, a soft edge of amusement in their tone. I know everything about you. You've always been an open book. I felt my skin prickle with unease. Stop calling me. This isn't funny. The line was silent for a moment, and I thought maybe they'd finally hung up. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, they said, Do you remember the old dollhouse in the attic? The one you used to play with every day, back when you were little? I gasped, my fingers going numb as I gripped the phone. How could they possibly know that? The dollhouse had been my favorite thing as a child, a small, intricately detailed model that my grandmother had given me. It had been packed away in the attic for years, forgotten until this moment. Who are you? I repeated, my voice barely more than a whisper. I'm just someone who knows you well, the voice replied. I know everything you've ever done, every secret you've ever kept, every choice you've ever regretted. The words felt like ice against my skin, a chill spreading through me as the realization dawned. Whoever this was, They knew things no one else could know, things I hadn't spoken of in years. The memories came flooding back, flashes of moments I'd buried, things I'd never thought I'd have to remember. I tried to gather my thoughts, to make sense of what was happening, but the voice continued, its tone now almost gentle, as if trying to soothe me. "Do you remember the promise you made?" they asked, their voice soft and coaxing. "What promise?" I stammered, struggling to think through the panic clouding my mind. Another laugh, low and quiet. "The one you made to yourself, back when you were just a little girl. The one you kept hidden, even from your closest friends. I know you haven't forgotten." I pressed my free hand to my forehead, feeling the weight of a memory I couldn't quite place, like something hidden in the dark corners of my mind. It felt close, just out of reach, a shadow on the edge of my consciousness. "You were so young then," the voice continued. "So innocent, yet even then, you held on to your secrets, didn't you?" The familiarity of the voice, the way it spoke as if it were me, looking back on my own life, made my skin crawl. It was like I was speaking to a version of myself, someone who knew every thought, every feeling, every buried regret. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice breaking. "Lily," the voice murmured, and this time there was no mistaking the familiarity. It was as if I were speaking to myself, a part of me that I'd long since buried. "You know what I'm talking about. You just don't want to remember." My hands trembled, the phone slipping slightly in my grip. I wanted to hang up, to end the call and run, but I couldn't move, trapped by the feeling that this voice held answers I didn't want to hear. I felt exposed, as though someone had opened a door to my past, letting in a flood of memories I wasn't prepared to face. "Why are you doing this?" I whispered, barely able to speak. "Because it's time," the voice said softly. "It's time to remember, time to face the promises you left behind." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me alone in the silence of the house. My hands shook as I set the phone down, the room feeling colder, as if the very air around me had changed. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, reaching across the walls, wrapping around me in a tight embrace. I sat there, numb and shaken, every word from the voice echoing in my mind. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a prank, and whoever was on the other end of the line wasn't just some stranger. They were someone who knew me, maybe better than I knew myself. The house was silent, but it was the kind of silence that pressed in from all sides, heavy and stifling. I tried to steady my breath, but my mind raced, replaying every word the voice had said. How could they know so much about me, about things I'd never told anyone? The voice felt too close, too familiar, as if it was coming from somewhere deep within myself. A chill washed over me, and I reached for the phone, half dreading and half hoping it would ring again. Minutes passed, then hours, and I began to wonder if maybe that was it, if maybe I'd heard the last of it. But the quiet was thick, unnatural, and I knew, somehow, that it wasn't over. It was nearly midnight when my phone lit up again, the same unknown number flashing on the screen. My heart raced as I picked it up, my fingers trembling, and I forced myself to answer. "Hello?" This time, the voice was softer, almost a whisper, and I knew right away that it was my own voice. "Lily," it said almost gently, "it's time we talked." My mouth went dry. What are you?" There was a pause, a silence that stretched between us, and then the voice answered, each word slow and deliberate. "I'm you, Lily. I'm the part of you that you left behind, the part that you buried. Don't you remember?" A memory stirred in the back of my mind, but I couldn't place it, like a shadow flickering just beyond reach. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice breaking. "How can you be me?" The voice sighed, a sound filled with a sadness that made my chest tighten. "You've forgotten, haven't you? You promised you wouldn't forget. You promised you'd remember." I closed my eyes, flashes of memories surfacing, moments from my childhood, fragments of promises I'd made to myself in secret, promises I'd buried, hoping they would disappear. But here they were, coming back to life through this haunting, disembodied voice. "You can't keep hiding, Lily," the voice continued, its tone now sharper, almost accusing. "You can't just leave pieces of yourself behind and expect them to stay quiet. They remember. I remember." The words cut through me like a knife, a chill settling in my bones as I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt and dread. Memories flooded my mind, things I'd tried so hard to forget, Choices I'd made, regrets I'd buried. The voice was dredging them all up, bringing them to the surface, forcing me to face parts of myself I'd long since abandoned. "Stop," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't want to remember. I want you to leave me alone." But the voice only grew stronger, filled with a dark intensity that made my skin crawl. "You can't get rid of me, Lily. I'm part of you. I've always been here, waiting for you to remember, waiting for you to acknowledge me." I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight, and no words came out. The voice continued, relentless, as though it was weaving itself deeper into my mind, taking root in places I couldn't reach. "You can't keep running from yourself," it murmured. "You can't keep burying the past. I am the choices you made. I am the promises you broke. I am every memory you tried to forget. And now, I'm here, and I'm never leaving." The room seemed to close in around me, shadows pooling in the corners, stretching across the walls. I felt surrounded, trapped, as though the voice was physically pressing in, filling every inch of the room, every corner of my mind. It was like staring into a mirror, only to find that the reflection staring back was something darker, something twisted. I gripped the phone, my knuckles white, and forced myself to speak. "What do you want from me?" There was a pause, and then in a voice that sent chills down my spine, it answered, "I want you to remember. I want you to accept me. Only then can you be whole." My heart pounded as I realized what it was asking, the full weight of it settling over me. It wanted me to confront every part of myself I'd spent years trying to forget, to embrace the shadows I'd ignored. It wanted me to bring all those pieces back into the light, to make peace with the parts of myself I feared. I felt tears spill down my cheeks as I whispered, "I don't know if I can." The voice softened, almost tender, like a distant memory of myself offering comfort. "You have to, Lily. I've been waiting for you all this time. I am you, and you are me. We belong together." The line went dead, leaving me in the dark, the silence stretching endlessly around me. But I could still feel the presence of the voice, lingering in my mind, as if it had always been there, waiting patiently for me to listen. And for the first time, I let myself remember the choices I'd made, the regrets I'd buried, the promises I'd broken. As I sat there, alone in the darkness, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. The fear ebbed away, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The voice was right. It was a part of me, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't keep running from it. In the silence, I felt it, the weight of my past settling back into place, filling the empty spaces within me. I took a deep breath, letting it all in, embracing the memories, the choices, the regrets. They were mine, and for the first time, I accepted them. When I looked at my reflection in the dark window across the room, I saw myself staring back, my eyes calm, and I felt whole, a fragile, tentative peace that had been waiting for far too long. But just as I thought it was over, my phone buzzed again, a soft vibration against the silence. I looked down, heart pounding, and saw the unknown number flashing on the screen. And in the quiet, I realized that some parts of ourselves are never truly forgotten. They live on, waiting, watching, ready to remind us that they are still here.